Okay, our second panel this morning, and we're shifting gears somewhat. The second panel will focus on labor trafficking, and the panel is moderated by Terry Coonan. He's the executive director of Florida State University's Center for the Advancement of Human Rights, where he also teaches law and criminology. Professor Coonan?
Good, thank you. Yeah, we're changing pace significantly as we look at a different type of human trafficking crime, but one that we now understand may actually be even more prevalent nationwide than sex trafficking. We see it, as we talked about, hiding in plain sight throughout our U.S. economy. We've seen cases really in all 50 states, but cases that in many ways are more difficult for law enforcement to investigate. And we have seen, of course, far fewer prosecutions in labor trafficking. We've seen a great many of them on the federal side, far fewer on the state side. What we'd like to look at today, number one, where are the sectors of our U.S. economy where trafficking occurs? We have with us two great panelists. Dan Werner from the Southern Poverty Law Center has done phenomenal work starting early in his career, looking at trafficking in the farm worker sector, but then now looking at it also in a great many other sectors that he'll talk about. And Meredith, Dank, one of the premier researchers in the country, who's looked at both sex and labor trafficking trends. And what we'd like to talk about, first of all, is what is it that researchers are telling us? What is it that researchers or senior litigators, such as Dan, what can you tell us about labor trafficking? Where does it occur, and how is it that it at times hides in plain sight? Oh, I'm sorry, Meredith. We'll look first to you for, again, great research that has looked at in a number of different parts of the United States. Where is it that labor trafficking turns out to proliferate?
And as a researcher, it's very odd for me to be up here without a PowerPoint. So what you all have in your pamphlet are some slides that I'm going to go over, because I think it's just easier that if you have numbers, it's easier to follow along with the numbers. So you'll see a couple of slides in your actual folder that we can follow along with. So just a little bit of background. I'm going to be speaking specifically about a research study that my colleagues at the Urban Institute, Northeastern University, conducted in collaboration with the Freedom Network, which the Southern Poverty Law Center is part of. This was a study that was funded by the National Institute of Justice in 2011. And there's been very little research that's been done specifically on labor trafficking. So there were huge gaps that we were hoping to fill with this research. What we were looking specifically at was the victimization experiences of those who've been labor trafficked, from the point of recruitment in their origin country all the way through seeking services and help from service providers like the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we went and we worked with a handful of Freedom Network providers across the country, and we were able to sample, read through, and sample 122 cases. They mainly were T-visa filed cases to look at exactly what the situations of these individuals were like. In addition to that, we did interviews with survivors of labor trafficking, in addition to interviews with service providers, law enforcement, and other folks who have handled cases like this, keeping in mind that the number of labor trafficking cases that have actually gotten to court is very small, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But I just wanted to give you a picture of who these individuals were, and so you can have a better understanding of who the victims and ultimately the survivors are. So in the cases that we looked at, the 122 cases, the top 6 countries were Mexico, the Philippines, Thailand, India, Indonesia, Guatemala. This was 100% a sample of non-U.S. citizens. We're not trying to say that labor trafficking only happens to foreign-born individuals. This was obviously a very specific and purposive sample that we chose from. And the organizations that we worked with only saw foreign-born cases. And I think that also is telling, and there have been media reports about U.S. citizens being labor trafficked throughout the United States. We just don't have much information, and so again, there's a huge knowledge gap around that. But overall, of all the cases that we looked at, it represented 29 different countries. So, and people are coming from all over the world, are being brought into the U.S. and being labor trafficked. As far as education, I think that there's a misunderstanding as to who is coming to the U.S. and working here, as far as level of education, level of socioeconomic background, and things of that sort. As you can see by the next slide, 13% of the individuals that we looked at had a college degree. even more had more than a college degree. So, and I know Dan's going to talk a little bit about the case, the Signal case, and those individuals were very highly educated who came here to work in the United States. When you're looking at who they are gender-wise, this is where maybe it's a little bit different than sex trafficking, although I think that there's more around that, men and trans individuals are also being sex trafficked. But 48% of the sample that we looked at that were trafficked were men, and 53% were women. Again, a vast majority of the cases we looked at were adults. As far as who's being trafficked into the U.S., we saw very few minors being brought here. Again, I think globally, you see a lot of child labor. There's still a lot we need to learn about whether or not child labor and to what extent exists here in the United States. And then at the average time of when they sought services, they were about 33 years of age. Venues, I think, is a really important thing to look at. And where is trafficking happening? As Terry pointed out, oftentimes it's happening in plain sight. So it's happening in places like here at hotel chains and hospitality sector. Private residences, we hear a lot about domestic work, domestic servitude. Particularly, there have been a couple of high-profile cases around diplomats. Only 6% of the cases that we looked at involved a diplomat. But I think that is probably much larger. Again, this is the sample of the cases we looked at. And those are really hard cases to find, to look into, to investigate, and ultimately to prosecute. Agriculture, construction, carnivals and fairs. So it's happening in all these different sectors. Regulated, unregulated, low-wage industries primarily. So again, for a lot of the people who are coming in on college degrees, who have college degrees or higher, the thought is that they'd be making more money than what they were making back at home. But it's still, many times, they're placed in low-wage industries. And even when they do leave the labor trafficking situation, given a lot of the challenges that they face, they are then almost forced to remain in those low-wage industries because the options are very few. I think visa, one of the more surprising findings from our study is the fact that over 70% of the individuals who came to the U.S. who were ultimately labor trafficked came on legal visas. So they were not necessarily, the idea of being smuggled in or coming across the border illegally. They were coming here legally on H-2A, H-2B visas, diplomat visas, a whole range of different visas. But if you look, by the time that they actually found services, which can be several years from the point of escaping the situation to the point of getting into finding a service provider, 69% at that point were unauthorized. And I will say authorization and visas and being here legal is a huge coercion factor for a lot of traffickers. This is something that they hold over the heads of the people that they're trafficking. Domestic workers were more likely to have their documents confiscated once they reached the U.S. And for a lot of times, if they did come on a valid visa, the trafficker would hold on to that visa, that passport. And then when it finally expired, they would say, you can have your passport back, but now you're illegal. No one's going to help you if you try to escape. The cops are going to come. They're going to deport you. And for a lot of these individuals, they are, very conscious and very law-abiding people. And even just the thought of breaking a law and potentially being deported back is a huge scare tactic for them. It's a huge fear for them. And especially because a lot of them go into debt to even come here. They are putting their homes and their land up for collateral. They're taking huge bank loans out from the local banks. And for them, it's all about paying that debt back and eventually helping their families back at home. And not being able to do that with the fear of deportation, the fear of all of these other things, they will continue to remain in that situation because they don't know who to go to for help. When you look at the suspects, around 60% of the cases we looked at, a suspect was arrested. However, for very few of those, it's hard to kind of trace what happens to those when you're looking at the documents. And for the most part, the service providers aren't necessarily tracking that, so they don't have that information. And if you look at various court documents, it's again, hard to find. But for very few of them actually went to prosecution. But if you look at the actual characteristics of the suspects, 68% were male, 32% were female, 47% were U.S. citizens, 49% were non-U.S. citizens. So you're seeing a lot of different dynamics than you would necessarily see potentially in a sex trafficking case. And you have a lot more women who are involved in this. We read through a lot of cases where, particularly with domestic work, the female, maybe the wife of the couple or somebody else, the woman in the situation, the grandmother, was oftentimes the primary abuser in the household. And then this chart, I think, is a really important one to look at. And it's a lot of you hear is confusion as, well, what's the difference between labor exploitation and labor trafficking? There's just too much gray area there. We don't really know when does something actually constitute meet the level of labor trafficking. So what we did when we went through the case files is take how essentially OSHA defines what labor exploitation is. And then we looked at the federal definition of what labor trafficking is, human trafficking, and we coded it based on that. And so as you can see by this, overwhelming amount of individuals experienced forms of labor trafficking victimization. Again, keeping in mind that the cases that we looked at were already identified as labor trafficking cases. So that makes sense that there would be an overwhelming amount there. But I think you can see that there is a lot of gray area here. Particularly, the middle shade, the light blue, the movement to work is controlled, victim lived where work. At what point, how many forms of these traffickings, the forms of victimization need to happen before it meets the level of trafficking? Does it have to be just one or two of these more egregious forms to meet the level of trafficking? These are still things we're trying to figure out, especially for those who file T visas and try to get immigration status for these individuals. What gets accepted, what doesn't get accepted, and then particularly if there's a prosecution, what is needed for evidence? And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about evidence and how you gather that in these kind of labor trafficking situations. So that's kind of how the picture I wanted to paint for right now. And
good. Thank you, Meredith. Let's transition to Dan. Dan has litigated especially civil damage cases for numerous victims and numerous types of victims around the United States. Dan, tell us about your work over the course of your legal life.
Sure. Well, I should start out saying over the course of my legal life, I think the most judges I've ever talked to at one time was 3 on appellate panels. This is obviously a little terrifying as a civil litigator, but also obviously a really great opportunity to kind of talk about the work that I and my colleagues have done representing human trafficking survivors in civil litigation. I think one reason I was invited to come here was because of a trial I worked on in January and February of this year on behalf of human trafficking survivors against a company called Signal International. This was in federal court in Louisiana. After a 5.5-week trial, the jury delivered a verdict of over $14 million for 5 victims. And I'll go into some of the lead up to this a little bit later. There were another 325 victims lined up to go to trial after this first trial. Needless to say, Signal has filed for bankruptcy now and has settled the case in bankruptcy. Still a very good settlement of over $20 million for all of the victims. But before I kind of tell this story of the case and my client's story, I wanted to step back to a few months before the trial. We, like plaintiffs' lawyers do, had a mock jury exercise. And it was split up into 3 panels, and we presented, I learned the meaning of the word clopening. We presented our case. We had a mock defense counsel present their clopening. And the jurors went in and deliberated our claims. And it was a mixed reaction. Some jurors saw it as trafficking, some didn't. One of the panels that decided it was not trafficking was really telling for us, and important for us to hear. The foreperson stood up and proclaimed, "I've seen Taken. This is not trafficking." And that was really actually, as upsetting as it was for us to hear that, it was also very important for us to hear that. Because at that point, we understood the uphill battle we faced leading up to trial to make sure that the jury would understand what human trafficking in fact is. And I should mention afterwards, I was just curious, and I would encourage all of you to do this. I did a Google Images search for human trafficking. And I should mention, my clients in this case, all of the plaintiffs in these collective cases are all adult male victims. If you do a Google Images search for human trafficking, you have to scroll through 130 images. I just checked a few days ago to find a single image of an adult male victim. So that also kind of shows how it's important to kind of reshape how, when representing adult male victims in particular, of labor trafficking, reshape how jurors understand trafficking. It's important, therefore, that jurors understand, that trafficking is a crime defined by the law and not by the internet. I laugh, but that's really what we're facing. So, there are common threads, and all of you, as I understand it, are state court judges. And the case that I brought was our trafficking claims were under the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But there are common threads across all state laws regarding human trafficking. And really that common thread is coercion. That traffickers can use nonviolent, subtle forms of coercion to force somebody to perform labor, be it a domestic worker, a farm worker, a construction worker, or a sex worker. If we as attorneys, and if the judiciary doesn't really encourage and push this broader view of what human trafficking is, then all of the efforts to pass this really important progressive legislation that really was designed to expand what can be prosecuted as forced labor and sex trafficking beyond the Reconstruction era statutes defining involuntary servitude. All those efforts were for naught if we all don't accept and educate the public and educate the jurors about what human trafficking is. I'll briefly talk about the Signal case. The case really starts with Hurricane Katrina. As all of you know, Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast. It also damaged a lot of oil rigs that were out in the Gulf. A company called Signal International, which was a marine fabrication and repair company that had 2 yards, one in Texas and one in Mississippi, saw this as a great opportunity to get a lot of work repairing the rigs that had been damaged. They were also faced with somewhat of a predicament because some of their workforce had been displaced. And they were using a lot of contract labor, which was more expensive for them to perform this work. Well, it just so happens that a labor recruiter who moonlighted as a police officer in South Mississippi approached Signal and said, I have this great deal for you. I can get you all the welders and fitters you need, skilled Class A welders and fitters from India. They can be your direct employees, and it won't cost you a dime to bring them in. And of course, Signal jumped on this opportunity. What a great deal. Did nothing to vet the recruiter, and then the recruiter then pulled in a lawyer and a recruiter in India. Did nothing to vet any of these men. What the recruiters and the lawyer ended up doing in India was advertising green card opportunities for these workers. And when workers came to a seminar, they were told, this is your dream opportunity to remake your life, bring your family to the United States with green cards. And it'll cost you, and it varied depending on the stage in the process when people first heard of it, between $12,000 up. The most that anybody ended up paying was $25,000. That's a lot of money. That's a heck of a lot of money for somebody in India. But they were paying for what they saw as this opportunity for permanent residency. But then what it really turned into was a bait and switch. At some point in the process, they were told, well, you're not going to come on green cards. You're going to come on H-2B visas. These are temporary or seasonal visas that, I should mention, tie you to that employer. And when the work is done, you got to leave and go back home. But they were told, okay, well, you're coming on these visas, but it'll turn into a green card, without telling the workers that H-2B is temporary, green card is permanent. They're the opposite. One does not lead into the other. But the workers paid this money based on these promises. They arrived at Signal, and our clients talked about how when they arrived at Signal, the shock they felt because they walked into the labor camps that Signal had built for them, saying that the workers from India would view them as being like the Taj Mahal, based on the workers' living standards in India. These were a series of double-wide trailers surrounded by a chain-link fence, 24 men to a trailer, in bunks with no privacy, a guard monitoring their comings and goings, periodic searches of their belongings. And for this, Signal charged the workers $1,050 a month each. And we got some great discovery in this case. And we got discovery where Signal described these labor camps. Not only were they increasing their profits by having cheaper labor, but they were increasing these profits because they called these labor camps a profit center. And the workers, needless to say, were distraught. They also were starting to get the sense that maybe these green card promises weren't going to come to fruition. And so they started to, and let me just mention, I want to just mention, there's nothing keeping the workers from leaving. And that's really important. This kind of goes to the point I was trying to make before. They could have just walked out and left. There was no guard. They weren't locked in. There was a fence. There was a guard at the gate, but the guard was never going to stop somebody from leaving. So what kept them there was their debt and then some subsequent events that I'll describe. The workers started to talk amongst themselves at a local Catholic church. They met with some lawyers, and word got back to Signal. And Signal's response was, before this week is over, this was in some emails, before this week is over, we're going to teach these workers and their liberal lawyers, I guess that's us, that they can't get away with this. And on March 9th, 2007, Signal engaged in a roundup of the people who it viewed as the troublemakers. And the idea was that they were going to forcibly deport them. They did it at a time when early in the morning when everybody was at the camp and everybody would see it. So they wanted to make a public spectacle among the other workers, that they would forcibly deport these troublemakers to send a message to everybody else. One of the workers was so devastated by the thought of returning back to India with debts that he would never be able to repay, that he tried to commit suicide. He went into a bathroom and slit his wrist. He survived. That did send a message to the workers, and it was terrifying for them. But as in any case where a trafficked person leaves without sort of being rescued, people reach a breaking point, and people reach their breaking point at different stages. Some reach their breaking point when they saw this man being carried across the labor camp covered in blood after he had tried to commit suicide. Some reached their breaking point later when it became entirely evident that these green card promises were lies. So a year later, a year after this roundup, we filed this civil case against Signal International. And I don't want to take up all the time. I very easily could. The case took 7.5 years, or 7.5 years to go to trial. We initially filed as a class action. Class certification was denied. We were disappointed, but I also think it's harder and harder to get classes certified. When class certification was denied, we sort of took it upon ourselves to try to find pro bono counsel for all the victims who still wanted to pursue their case, and it resulted in this really unprecedented collaboration between some of the top law firms in the country to represent groups of these workers. In the end, 232 of the workers were represented by pro bono counsel in a dozen or so cases. And it's really, people talk about the importance of pro bono work. This is really an absolutely fantastic example of how these kinds of collaborations really can work and can be effective. It was also really helpful to have these firms on board because we got 2.5 million documents. There were over 180 days of deposition testimony. Only one single issue ended up being, which was the discoverability of post-employment residence and immigration status, which, as an attorney representing survivors, I can say is really important to protect because that's something that traffickers and their counsel use to intimidate victims. That was briefed over 40 times, and it ended up resulting in about 12 different court orders. We ended up prevailing and were able to keep that information out. So what did we do then to sort of keep the jurors from being taken by taken, I guess would be a way to describe it. First of all, we throughout the trial, we did not talk about human trafficking. We talked about forced labor. Forced labor is what is called in the TVPA, in the federal law. And that sort of allowed us to kind of redefine a term that maybe the jurors weren't necessarily familiar with, sort of start from scratch rather than trying to kind of say, well, you think trafficking is this, but it's actually this. But something else, and I think this is really important, is we had a really terrific judge who understood labor trafficking at a very, I think, deep level, and her jury instructions really showed that. In the materials, I think I don't know if these are in a thumb drive or online, there's a copy of these jury instructions. But the jury instructions really sort of reflect the breadth of what human trafficking is, based not just on statutory authority, but also case law. So it makes it very clear that trafficking can involve, or forced labor, can involve psychological coercion, financial coercion, threats of reputational harm, that somebody can be paid, can get a salary, but still be a victim of trafficking. That somebody can physically walk out and still be a victim of trafficking. And these are some of the sort of nuances that were in the jury instructions that I really think during the 2 hours that it took to read 85 pages of jury instructions, whatever it was, I think that really hit home with the jurors, and I think that was very, very important. And I think was sort of a major component of why the jurors ended up finding that there was, in fact, forced labor here. And obviously, just wrapping up for our clients, this was a hugely important event in their lives. I'll certainly never forget. My cases don't go to trial, really. In federal court, our cases just don't go to trial. So it's very unusual for this to happen. And I have to say the pinnacle of my career was when the jurors came out and started saying yes to the liability on the various claims. And I know it was a highlight of my clients' lives as well. And I also hope that, aside from the great impact this has had on my clients, that this case has a broader impact. First of all, as a warning to other companies that you do this, it's a bet the company risk. Signal is going out of business because they did this. But also, in the legal community, I hope it serves as an opportunity to talk about labor trafficking and kind of the breadth of what it can involve. So, thank you.
Hey, Dan. Yeah, thank you. Dan's talk underscores the importance, especially of a private right of action, the ability for our victims to get punitive damages. That's a federal right in federal court, but interestingly, only 27 states allow that within their own legislation right now. Curiously, too, states such as Florida, New York, Texas do not allow for punitive damages. I think there's work for our legislators to do to especially deter this form of trafficking. The other thing we're learning, and we've learned this really from our advocates that are involved in the world of sex trafficking in the last decade or two, that one of the things they've taught us is that sex trafficking often hides under masking charges. So it's that young woman who's brought in for truancy or assault or a drug charge, when in fact she's deeply involved as a victim in the world of sex trafficking. But what we're now seeing is that labor trafficking also has masking charges, that in our state system, curiously, we had a large case in Florida, a large labor trafficking case that our Human Rights Center at Florida State University was involved with, a 5-star Hilton hotel called the Sandestin Hilton over in the Panhandle area, all young Eastern European women being brought in and trafficked for labor trafficking. It was Russian organized crime, and they very, very intentionally avoided anything that would approximate prostitution or forced prostitution. No, the young women were brought in on J-1 visas, initially told they'd work at Disney World. Once they got off the plane in Orlando, they were told, "Ooh, the bad news is that job at Disney World had disappeared, but the good news is we have a job up in the Panhandle. It only pays about $1 an hour, but you're going to get to work 70 hours a week in this beautiful Hilton resort on the Caribbean." And the young women came in. They had a plane ticket that would take them back to Eastern Europe at the end of the summer, and they all learned or knew it would cost about $2,000 to leave early. So all of them stayed. They stayed. They worked 70 hours a week in the Hilton Hotel. They earned $1 an hour. They slept in a condo with 20 other Russian girls on the floor right next to the Hilton. When the FBI went to the Hilton said, "Oh, you know what? We don't hire our maids. We hire a subcontractor who hires our maids." And this is the other real pattern that we're seeing around the country. It's often the subcontractors, Dan says, the labor recruiter, who is oftentimes the culprit. Big businesses, we do understand, engage in willful blindness. The Hilton was only too happy to look the other way and not ask any questions about why were their maids only, if you looked at it, being paid $1 an hour. If you did the math on that contract, the subcontract bid that the Russian organized crime group had put in, you would understand you could never earn a minimum wage from that type of arrangement. What was very interesting, though, from a state law perspective, is that the case started really in state courts and with state law enforcement. That a great many of those young European women understood that they were going back at the end of the summer, and they were in a resort town, and they began shoplifting with abandon. They would shoplift in the last 2 weeks that they were there in Destin. And when they were arrested, they knew, I will never be around when this case actually goes into court. And it was state court judges and law enforcement that started to ask the question, why are all these young women who've been arrested for shoplifting charges not appearing? When they scratched the surface, they realized this is actually a huge human trafficking case. It's labor trafficking, and these young women clearly, again, have engaged in some shoplifting, but they have been tremendously victimized by labor trafficking. Curiously, we saw another case in Florida that involved all U.S. citizens, African-American men that were singled out because they were homeless. They were recruited out of homeless shelters. Miami, Orlando. The trafficker went as far west as New Orleans, and he understood very quickly that a homeless person is the perfect trafficking victim. There's no one to miss them. They were lured to Palatka, Florida, a small city on the St. Johns River, about 30 miles from Jacksonville. And they were exploited for labor trafficking in a farm camp, but they were paid in crack cocaine every night. And on Friday, when they were supposed to have been paid their $500 for working that week, they instead were told, well, you owe us, the traffickers, $500 for the alcohol and the crack cocaine that we provided you with. Florida law enforcement very quickly understood that was the vulnerability of the U.S. citizen. That a great many of our victims, as Dan and Meredith mentioned, are foreign nationals, but we're now starting to see many U.S. national victims as well. If we could, we have, I believe, about 5 minutes. Let me just open the floor to questions that any of you might have on labor trafficking. Ma'am. And the question here is about what we call domestic servitude cases, literally house slaves that we're seeing all over the country, often an ethnic connection, typically that child or adult recruited from another country by yet a family from that country. We've seen diplomat cases, but a great many people who were not diplomats, who simply had that home connection. Dan, Meredith, any thoughts on that, if that has intersected in your research or your litigation?
I mean, with the research, the cases that we looked at were domestic servitude. I mean, 56% of the victims escaped on their own. So there was very few law enforcement intervention. In the cases where there might be a neighbor or a good Samaritan that the person is lucky enough to encounter, then they've been able to get help that way. But I think those tend to be some of the more really isolated cases, and at least the cases that we reviewed, they're definitely the most vulnerable. So as far as how you get access to those individuals, I think it's really difficult, and it's a big question mark. I mean, there are networks across the country for domestic workers, but that would require them having access to communication, which a lot of them are cut off from. So I think it's just being vigilant as citizens, and the chances when they do go out maybe to the playground or to the grocery store is to kind of look for signs of control, if somebody's monitoring where they're going and things of that sort. But I think that they tend to be some of the more really difficult cases.
A number of our victims in that area have been rescued as a result of interventions by school officials, by public health officials in emergency rooms, and by informed neighbors. They're the toughest cases for law enforcement because many times that child has very limited access, or victim, even an adult, to the outside world. We also see the psychological coercion that Dan mentioned. So many of them are doing child care that becomes the bond that oftentimes keeps them in that home. Oh, if I left, if I ran, who would take care of these children? So that we start to see really what we call the invisible chains of modern slavery so prevalent in those areas. And if you could identify where you're from, too.
Thank you. Yes, I'm from Maine. Mr. Werner, I wanted to know what you did in terms of victim maintenance. And by that I mean having them still present and available and willing to pursue the prosecution.
Sure. One thing, as I mentioned earlier, that we fought long and hard for was this protective order to prevent sort of where they lived, their immigration status, where they may have worked after they left Signal. And so reporters ask me a lot, so where are they now? And I say, well, I can't answer that, but let me tell you why. So that's kind of my response to you. I can broadly say, the services that are available to trafficking survivors are extensive, both in terms of immigration relief in the form of T visas and the public benefits that are available to survivors. I can say my clients are fine. They're doing well. But I want to kind of explain why I can't sort of give specifics about that.
And just to add to that, I think a big piece of this is continued presence that is not often given. And there are a lot of the victims have an acute need to work immediately upon getting the services. And so that's why, A lot of them don't seek help, is because there is that huge time lapse between when they could get the T visa and maybe get some, work permit, or why if they initiate the process, might eventually abandon the process because they're not often offered the continued presence, and so they can't work immediately. So I think that work permit and that continued presence is a huge, often missing piece of that.
Yeah, and if I could just one other thing that in another trafficking case I worked on, we actually had the judge in the case certify the U visas, and that's something I think any judge can do. And there are a couple reported decisions now where judges have done that, so that's something that may be worth looking into.
And just a final thought on where you may see this as state court judges. Labor trafficking will, of course, often hide in plain sight. It may be through a labor subcontract or through a wage and hour violation, but increasingly it may be through assaults. It may be through something that has been done to a victim. How very, very important it is for judges as well as juries to be able to look beneath the surface of someone who is in one of their courtrooms. There may, in fact, be labor trafficking that is really at the heart of their issue. Thank you all very much.
I think there's
Oh,
one
last one. Yeah. One final
I assume they're not applauding for me, but I'll take it. I just have a follow-up. Are there any findings that judges need to make to facilitate the issuance of visas for people to remain here, either available as witnesses or subsequent to the end of the trial?
Those tend to be federal remedies. Again, a victim can get a T visa if they have been, again, someone who has been subjected to a trafficking case. But the U visa, very, very importantly, for any immigrant victim, typically of a violent crime. And as Dan mentioned, increasingly judges are being allowed to sign off on that, as are Department of Children and Families, as well as law enforcement and prosecutors and state attorneys' offices as well. Real important role in actually helping our victims stabilize.
Great.